And I have the privilege of reading Pastor Jeff's sermon for today. And the people stood by watching, but the leader scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation. Don't you fear him? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we're getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." He replied. Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." "Truly I tell you," Jesus replied, "today you will be with me in paradise." I don't know how to break this to you, Pastor Jeff says, but Christmas is just around the corner. Even without a calendar, I would know that because Walmart is putting out Easter decorations. Just kidding. I'm not kidding about Christmas being just around the corner. Next Sunday is the first Sunday in Advent, and 3 weeks after that comes Christmas Eve. So it always comes as something of a shock to hear the gospel reading the church appoints for this Sunday. On this last Sunday in the church liturgical year, as Pastor Everett reminded us, the Sunday designated as Christ the King Sunday, when we're announcing, putting up Christmas decorations, and talking about Christmas gathering, what we hear as a gospel reading is not a passage which looks forward to Christmas, but back to Good Friday. As we prepare to celebrate the birth of Christ, what we hear about is the death of Christ. As we prepare to welcome the babe born in Bethlehem, what we hear about is the one who was executed as a criminal on Golgotha. As we prepare to rejoice in the wonder of it all, what we hear about is the horror of it all. Maybe Walmart should put out Christmas decorations after all. And yet, maybe this is just a passage we need to hear today as Christmas approaches, because it tells us just who it is we do welcome at Christmas. In the babe born at Bethlehem, we welcome the Christ who is King. And it can help us prepare for Christmas by helping us see who this babe, this Christ, this King truly is. And so, who is this Christ who is King? Well, right off the bat, this passage tells us that the very idea of Christ the King is for many people a laughable idea, a joke. As one commentator has pointed out, the title, the nameplate put over the head of Jesus on the cross was meant as the punchline of a joke. It was a cartoon caption, "The King of the Jews." That was government's assessment of Jesus as a king, a bad joke. But notice who's leading the laughter and prompting the crowds in their jeers. It's the religious leaders of all people. To religion, Christ the King was a joke. Even one of the criminals crucified with Jesus joined in the fun. "You're the Messiah? Tell me another one." And Jesus was seen to be a joke because he did not have the kind of power a king should have. Governments define power in terms of political clout and military force. Jesus had neither. And religion often defines power in terms of miracles. But there was no miracle that day. And what do people want from a God? Usually the power to avoid suffering and death. Jesus avoided neither. And so, to talk about Christ the King is to talk about a very different kind of king and a very different kind sense, but the very power of God. And what is this power? Well, the passage tells us that it is a power that does not avoid suffering and death, but that works through suffering and death. A power that can even defeat suffering and death and all that seeks to undo us. When the other criminal called out to Christ as king and asked Jesus to remember him, Jesus replied, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And whatever else that might mean, surely it means that this Christ has the power to give life even in the midst of death. That he has a power not even suffering can defeat. And it tells us too that when we dare to call forth Christ in faith and name him as king, he responds to us as well with life. But this passage also tells us that power is hidden in suffering or defeat or death. That this power is at work right where the world thinks only despair and death is at work, where all seems lost and helpless. And this power is at work in people whom the world often derides and considers of little consequence or worth. It's at work, hidden in the very things that seem to deny it. But it's a power which breaks through now and then, the story says, and we catch a glimpse of it. Glimpse it where people live as if Christ is king, sovereign over their lives and hearts, where people serve and give of themselves and even suffer for the sake of Christ, where people allow Christ's love to rule them and lead them in love to others. We see it where people build bridges of understanding over deep chasms of fear and suspicion and bring healing and hope, where someone is a friend to another and help is given, where people are not ruled by self-interest and gain, but offer themselves to the needs of others and even suffer with another, where peace is dared and darkness and evil are challenged. We see it wherever you and I seek to be Christ to the other. It's a different kind of power, not power as the world defines it, but the power of God's love and mercy to transform the human heart and our very lives. But what we need to realize is that still today it's laughable, a joke to many people. You certainly won't hear politicians speak of a crucified God or a way of life that calls for sacrificial love. I doubt if any candidate from any party running from any office in the recent election spoke of a crucified God. It's not exactly a big vote getter. The God whose name the politicians invoke is not this God. And if a politician did, he or she would be laughed right out of town. And this crucified God is not exactly what most people are looking for either. They don't want a God who works through suffering and death and calls for the same among his followers. They want a God who magically and miraculously makes all well without demanding anything. A God who will bless them with success and wealth and agree with their views on the poor and hurting and ask nothing of them. A God who comforts only and never challenges. To believe in a crucified God might be something for the funny papers, but not for their lives. Even much of religion today finds this crucified Christ to be a joke. So much of religion today proclaims a Christ who is resurrected without dying, a Christ who gives power to succeed rather than serve, to make us comfortable rather than committed. So much of religion today removes the cross from the Christian life. A group in one major religious body actually suggested that crosses be removed from churches because, after all, the cross is such a negative symbol. So much of religion today is simply the proclamation of the power of positive thinking rather than the power of Christ. In so many ways in our society and religion, Christ the King is laughed at. And those who truly try to follow this King, who call for compassion, who question the never-ending desire for more and more, who call us to accountability for our care of God's earth, who challenge the prevailing views of the poor or homeless, who bring comfort to the broken down wrecks of this world or outcasts, who sacrifice time and energy and money for the sake of God and the sake of others. They're laughed at as well. For many people, Christ the King is still a cartoon caption. But for those who allow this Christ to be sovereign in their lives, to rule their hearts and minds, to shape their values and behavior, He is their hope and peace and joy. Because finally, the power He has is the power to hold back the chaos and establish a reign of peace and order and hope within us and on this earth. Throughout the Old Testament and the New, from the first stories of creation in Genesis to the last stories of a new creation in Revelation, the Bible speaks of life as being constantly threatened by chaos. Chaos is always near, always threatening to break through. God brought forth order out of chaos at the beginning of time, but still the chaos was there, and it was the role of kings in the Bible to hold the chaos back and establish order and peace. And finally, that is the power of Christ the King. You and I know much about chaos being near, chaos barely held back in our lives, things coming undone. And we know much about chaos always threatening our communities and nation, confusion and disorder always close. And the power of Christ the King is the power to establish the reign of peace and order in our hearts and lives we so desperately want, to put our faith in Him, to allow Him to live and rule within us. To welcome Him is to know a peace beyond anything the world can understand. And in Him we see as well how peace and order come to reign in our communities as Christ pushed back hopelessness and chaos one emergency at a time. As Christ waded into the thick of the darkness to bring light. As Christ worked new beginnings, so too are we to do as His people, His church. We are to be people unafraid to confront the emergencies and chaos, wade into life, and keep working to bring new beginnings wherever we can. The Apostle Paul put it best in our second lesson, in Christ all things hold together. In lives that have a tendency to be lives in which all things keep coming apart, in lives and communities in which chaos seems always near, to believe in this crucified King is to know a power and a way of life in which all things are held together in hope. And so we turn toward Christmas. What we hear is that the one who is born in Bethlehem is truly a king who has the power to bring life out of death, order of chaos, and hold all things together. And that is no joke. To have Christ reign within us is to have peace and hope for this earth as well, and to be set laughing with great joy.